Many of us tend to think of temperance as a purely negative and perhaps strenuous restraining of human passion and desire. Yet Aquinas calls temperance serenity of the spirit. Indeed, the serenity that fills the inmost recesses of the human being and is the seal and fruit of order, as Joseph Pieper writes. Today we're going to be digging into the fourth of the four cardinal virtues, temperance, on this episode 22 of Deep in Christ. Hello and welcome back to Deep in Christ. I'm your host, JonMarc Grodi, here at the Coming Home Network International, sharing with you another discussion about our daily task of growing deeper in relationship with and in imitation of our Lord Jesus Christ. Thanks again for being here. Today, Father Peter joins me again for another discussion on the virtues. We've been going through this long study, and we're now turning to the fourth of the four cardinal virtues, temperance. Now, temperance, like all the virtues, is a concept, is a word that has picked up a lot of baggage. We have to kind of start by examining the word, examining our preconceptions of the notion of this virtue. We tend to think of temperance purely in its moderating function, not eating too much, not drinking too much, etc. But there's a lot more to temperance. As I said earlier, Aquinas calls temperance this serenity of spirit that arises from an inner order. Unlike the other virtues, temperance is the virtue that turns inward to the inner life of man and examines the order or disorder. And again, in prudence, along with the cardinal virtues, it seeks to put order into that inner life. And again, so that on that may be the negative side, this restraining, this ordering, this need to moderate, this need to temper. But then there's the positive fruit of that, which is this serenity of spirit, this purity of heart, this greater openness, greater ability to love God. And that's the goal of temperance. So we're digging into this new study today. Father Peter and I, we had a really good discussion. I hope you enjoy it. Let's dig in. Today we are starting our study on temperance. And, what's funny about this is that we actually tried to start this study a couple weeks ago. Yep. We lost some footage there. But you know what? I'm kind of glad.
Then followed a quite intemperate destruction of the studio.
I went and did some. No, I feel like since then it's been on my heart and my mind, and I feel like I've worked through my thoughts a little bit more. And I think that's good because I'm realizing that I think temperance of the four cardinal virtues, in some ways it's the most complex because it gets down and deals with our complex humanity, our complex system of drives and passions, and a whole world within us that has a lot of disorder as a result of the fall, and an area of our life that takes it's the process of our whole life to bring that into order, cooperating with the grace of God. But I just think for a lot of reasons, some of which I think we'll get into, is just that it's a more complex virtue than the others. I think there's also more sub-virtues. There are more kind of perfections and imperfections of temperance. More areas that we can really see it fleshed out in the ways that we have to work on virtue in our life.
Yeah, and the other cardinal virtues, it would seem that the material or the kind of the good versus evil fights that they're dealing with tend to be a bit more stark when it comes really down to it. In the sense that prudence in one really big sense is a battle between truth, reality, and falseness and unreality.
Yeah,
right?
It's a very singular truth.
Very singular.
Everything else.
Yeah, in a very singular division. It's real or it's not real, or it's truth or it's not untruth. In the sense that you're trying to face oneself to reality when you do that, and trying to dispel the untruths, that assuage our senses and our minds. Mm-hmm. Justice is very much a facing of this is right and this is wrong, in an ultimate sense.
And it's very objective.
Very objective.
It's like real relationships out there in the world.
Yeah. Fortitude, fortitude is it's getting farther and closer to where things are a bit muddier, but it ultimately comes down to, enduring things that would keep us back from basically doing what is just, things that would withhold us fear and things like that, and facing through those things. But But temperance, because of it turns in towards ourselves, and it deals with an interplay between, as we will talk about later, a selflessness, a desire, and injustice, not injustice, but with justice, desire for love of God and love of the other, first and foremost. But because it has to take that into an interplay with things like self-preservation and self-care and different things like that, there's a sort of a muddying, it's not muddying in the sense of true grayness, but it's harder to kind of actually be able to discern and distinguish, and be able to say this is the right thing. So
I think it deals a lot more with like finding the virtuous mean in things. It's not about it's neither overeating nor undereating. It's trying to eat well and eat right in order to take care of your body. And so it's a much more practical nitty-gritty of trying to find out what's the right way, in a concrete, practical way.
It's being like a wizard.
How so?
This one wizard is never early nor late. He arrives precisely when he means to.
Nice. So Temperance is a wizard. That's what we got so
Temperance
far.
is a wizard.
Let's talk.
Turn that into a t-shirt.
Before we get deep into this, let's just kind of address. I love how Joseph Pieper, our muse for this study, he always starts with the word and looks at the ways that it's commonly used and the common impressions that we have about it, because oftentimes we have to disabuse those notions a little bit in order to really be receptive to the full meaning of the word. And so, one thing he points out at the beginning of his section on temperance is he's going back a little bit to when he did a similar thing with prudence, on how popularly when we hear prudent or prudence, we're usually thinking of something extremely dull and weak and kind of pathetic. We might think of prudence sometimes wrongly as something that's opposed to courage. There's the courageous man who goes out and gets stuff done, and the prudent person cautiously stands in the back. And of course, he disabused of that notion thoroughly. That's not prudence at all. In fact, courage is not courage unless it's coming out of prudence. Prudence means turning to reality and seeking the right. So with that in mind too, he uses this phrase, prudent moderation is something we might hear as kind of this common way to sort of calm down anyone who's getting too excited, even about something good, like, you're taking you're taking your relationship with Jesus way too seriously. Moderation in all things,
Yeah, don't be a Jesus freak.
Yeah, just kind of be normal like us, and that's certainly not what moderation as a component of temperance means.
And we've made this joke,
a bland moderation of all of you.
Yeah, and we made this joke before too, that it's his way of going about it is a very prudent way of going about it, because ultimately that's what it does. It's, first of all, it just takes a step back and tries to find the ways that the wool has sort of been pulled over our eyes by kind of our contemporary understanding of these words or just these notions. You know, so for getting to temperance, it's on one hand the thing that he tries to help us to understand is that the word is used wrong, but also just that our notion of the virtue of temperance, as we'll get into later. Yeah. Even just kind of taking the word aside, but just in terms of like what things we strive for in terms of kind of selflessness, and of tempering oneself. Even those things, we tend to go overboard, but not in the sense of just kind of being too severe with them, but just not hitting the right means, by which that not seen in the right way. So he starts very prudently by stepping back and saying, okay, well, that's what's real,
Yeah. I want to read this quote here that addresses some of that. This is on 145. Pieper writes, "We all know that the term prudent moderation tends to crop up whenever... We all know that the term prudent moderation tends to crop up when the love of truth or some other generous impulse threatens to take an extreme risk. This emasculated concept of moderation has no place in a doctrine which asserts that the love of God, fountainhead of all virtues, knows neither mean nor measure." Again, temperance, it does involve a moderation, a tempering, a restraining, a defending. We'll talk through all that as we go. But on the other side of that reordering of what maybe is disordered within us is a full flowering of our human being. And that's what this is about. It's, we've mentioned the quote a couple times, make of yourself a capacity and I will make myself a torrent, is that was words that a mystic received from our Lord, that as we make ourselves open, as we purify our hearts in temperance, we're more open to be able to be fully attached, fully in love, fully enlivened by God's grace. And that's what this is about. So there is a negative aspect of it, a pulling back, a restraining, a tempering, a meeking the horses, so to speak. But it's for a purpose. It's for a flowering. It's for a flourishing. Yeah.
What isn't temperance?
What is intemperance?
What isn't temperance?
What isn't temperance?
Let's just start at the beginning of the alphabet. We started getting there, that it's not just purely moderation.
Right.
In the sense of, it's not moderation for moderation's sake.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not just this idea like, well, just eat less or drink less. You know, that there's, which is funny because there's no positiveness to that. There's no doing this for the sake of something else, some other good that will be kind of preserved by just that definition.
Right.
Most of the time when we do eat less, it can be oriented. You know, it can inevitably kind of turn and point itself towards another good.
Yeah.
A good thing. Drinking less, we preserve kind of our rational, our rational self in all means, in all ways, and oftentimes it's just for us better bodily in a number of different ways. But in and of itself, just to kind of focus on that as the virtue, it's not much. You know, that's just a negative thing. That's just kind of bringing us sort of back from some craziness. You know. But
I guess another thing temperance is not. It is, again, as we said before, it is not in contradiction and not in conflict with any of the other virtues. And maybe that's a key here, is that temperance is courageous. Temperance is just. Temperance is prudent. You know, so the person, again, that there's a restraint in temperance proper. There's a restraining, and ordering, a tempering, but then that is in concert with a greater boldness and courage. That is in concert with the ability to do what is right. You know, to do justice in all my relationships. The ability to be prudent, to be a person who is fiercely, radically devoted and converted to reality. And so, again, maybe in some sense, all the virtues, they round out each other. You know, we got into prudence, and that made more sense to the other virtues. But then justice elaborated on what prudence does, and then courage showed more of what justice looks like in action when it's difficult. Well, so too with temperance, we see that all those virtues, in some sense, lead us to this ordering, this tempering of our inner life, but also that they all depend, they all kind of draw some of their power from whether or not whether the person proper, whether my inner life, my passions, my desires, whether they're tempered and ordered well, then all those other virtues receive a greater power, a greater flourishing through that. And so there's this, again, always this interconnectivity between these different perfections of the human soul, habitual perfections.
That line you read earlier, he said moderation also, quote unquote moderation also, is too negative in its implication and signifies too exclusively restriction, curtailment, curbing, bridling, and repression, which are all in contradiction to the classic prototype of the fourth cardinal virtue. So he says those things are in contradiction to the classic prototype of the fourth cardinal. Classic prototype not meaning the way that we have misaligned it, but classic meaning the true meaning. So to exclusively talk about it in terms of restriction, or to exclusively to talk about it in terms of curbing or bridling or repression, it does reinforce something actually I was talking about before the show. That I still sometimes do see kind of a negative curtailing aspect to it, but to talk about it exclusively as that, as just curtailing passion, is like, it's like a person meeking a horse and then sticking it in the stable and never pulling it out. You know, I mean, in the sense that the reason that we order the passions within us is so that they can receive, they can be put in force to what is good, right? You know, towards the right good, not just so they can be repressed and stuck in some shadowy, dark place of our soul and being from whence they never come out.
Yeah, there's that classic quote, perhaps apocryphal quote. I don't remember which church father was alleged to have said it, but the glory of God is man fully alive. You know, to be fully alive, and that doesn't mean to be less human. That means to be more human. You know, so all of our human nature is fully alive, fully in harmony. And it seems like that would be this image of temperance, a man fully alive, a woman fully alive in their humanness, in cooperation with God's grace.
Yeah, my hunger, to bring it to food, which is something we have, obviously, talk about when it comes to temperance.
Yeah.
My hunger and my capacity. It's funny. I love that. I was just thinking of Pirates of Penzance, the old play, right? The when he's talking, they're singing about the pirates, and the policemen are singing about the pirates and everything. Mm-hmm. It says when their minds are not engaged in their employment, or wrapped up in some felonious little plan, their capacity for innocent enjoyment is just the same as any honest man.
This is a show of very high culture,
absolutely.
Right here, referencing old.
We're drinking tea,
classical opera.
It's coffee.
Here, yeah.
But the point is that my ability to not only like to satiate my hunger. Yeah. And that desire to satiate my hunger, which is a matter of self-preservation, but also my capacity to enjoy my food, are good things. Yeah. They are very good things. Now, because of our fallenness, there's kind of a ravenous sort of wanting to sort of to take, and for only the purpose of that enjoyment in such a way that actually is harmful to my being, and so it goes against self-preservation too. Yeah. But the thing is that in curtailing and ordering those things, we actually gain the ability to enjoy those pleasures more, we would say, in the sense of, there's a true beauty to, sitting there for a minute and eating a single strawberry, There's a beauty to that in the sense of that we're able to appreciate it more and stuff like that, and we're able to control ourselves. And there's even just a serenity, as you like to use, about just that ability to sit there and enjoy a single thing in moderation with great appreciation.
It's perhaps helpful to start with some of these images that we can have in our mind going forward. We would imagine the temperate saint as being the person for whom, again, their hunger, their thirst, their sexual desire is something that wherever it's experienced, it's this positive thing. So their hunger for food when it is time to eat, that they really enjoy, and that there's an ever greater gratitude and a wonderment at the Creator for His creation. And when it's time to fast, or when it's just not time to eat, again, even the experience of hunger is a reminder of being alive. It's the sense of vitality. It's this hunger that reminds the person what their true purpose is. It's not food. It's you can imagine the saint for whom even those experiences of those desires, those passions, are all turned around to be something that always points back to God, whether it's a time to feast or a time to fast. And that's in stark contrast to most of us, and I put myself at the first of the line here, who tends to swing between overindulgence and then like a reactive asceticism, like eating too much and then being like, oh gosh, I need to just not look at food again,
Yeah.
And so that's what we tend to, when we don't have temperance, we tend to swing between these actions and overreactions, rather than becoming a person for whom this harmonious inner life always at every moment points us to a greater love of God.
In many ways, temperance really, or this proper understanding of temperance really aligns with and is in some ways, I think, not a summation, but a large and important piece, if not just the kind of central underlying piece of the recent, and rightly so, the recent obsession with the theology of the body. I mean, because that's in a reaction against kind of a Puritan understanding of the body that has just been around for so long, that just sees the things of the body as just wrong and need to be basically just curtailed and kind of shut in a cage inside our souls.
The theology of the body, is this a collection of teachings from St. John Paul the Great, St. John Paul II, Pope John Paul II, and he did these catechetical teaching on the meaning and purpose of the human body and sexuality. And again, the connection, the significance here in particular is that the body is good, created by God to be good, created by God to image Himself. And so we tend to look at the body only in its disorder and tend to end up with this really negative view of the body, rather than seeing, what was the original order? Yes, it's been broken and it needs some reordering. It needs healing.
It needs temperance.
But in its when it's flowered, when it's reordered, we can see there what God was trying to do. We can see how the body, the human sexuality, the family, how they image God. They teach us about God. They teach us about His plan. And so, there was a huge focus in the past 10, 20 years on that. And exactly as you're saying, it's because it was responding to a swing in the other direction of a real negativity toward the body, at some times in some ways in Christianity and in culture. And then, of course, the swingings between a very Puritan negative sense of the body and then an unrestrained sexual liberation, sexual revolution kind of attitude. And so, again, temperance is this reordering where we see what the body, what it really is for, and the real beauty of what it looks like when the human person is fully alive.
Right, in theology of the body, usually when we talk about it, we're usually kind of talking about, we oftentimes would make reference of it in terms of the sexual person, but ultimately it is the theology of our bodies in its full sense.
Yeah.
It's going to be ultimately, it's ultimately trying to recondition and help us to rediscover just our self-understanding of our bodies in a positive way, and having a kind of a positive way in which we can cultivate virtue within kind of our bodies. And ultimately that's what we're doing with temperance, and trying to kind of take a step back and look at what are the ways that we've wrongfully thought of temperance as just restraint, as just moderation when it comes to all these different things. One capacity of it being chastity and unchastity. But what is the way in which it actually is about positively ordering our bodies according our beings? A lot of the things having to do with the body ultimately in temperance, but how is it a way of ordering our urges and our desires and our powers of being in such a way as to mirror and to get back to what was the original proper ordering that God has written into our beings, that has become disordered by the fall.
Yeah, oftentimes in reference to theology of the body. And again, this may be something that our audience is not necessarily familiar with. We'll talk about it more in the future, and certainly there's a lot of great resources out there on the theology of the body. It's a great teaching, but it's extremely scriptural. Looking at in the beginning, God made them in His image, male and female, and we see the effect of the fall, but we also see Christ saying, in the beginning it was not so. It was not supposed to be this way, and calling us back to a recapturing of the original purpose and beauty of marriage, marital love in the case of sexuality. But I love the wedding at Cana as an image of, Christ, He goes to a wedding, and what is He doesn't go there and hey, you're all eating too much and you shouldn't be drinking alcohol, and he takes a very high view of this marriage, so much that becomes the place of His first public miracle, and He gives far from crashing the party, He goes there and gives them better wine. And that's a great image of what, again, Christ wants to do to our fallen human nature. We find ourselves disordered. We find our humanness broken, but He wants to give us healing. He wants to reorder us. He wants to get us back to that original order, that our desire for food and drink and sex and all our other drives and passions reordered so that they become this dynamism, this power that pulls us closer to Him. So we've started with a lot of images, but
a lot of images and a lot of So we should maybe we're moving more into. Are we moving this first episode more into kind of what it is strictly?
Yeah, we'll have a few more bullet points here. So one thing, so in trying to specify this a bit more, Pieper talks about, one way he describes it as temperance is this serenity of spirit that flows from an inner ordering. Temperance it disposes the various parts to work as an ordered whole. So it's a harmony. It's an inner harmony. And as you pointed out earlier, unlike the other virtues, prudence looks toward the big things, the principles. The first principles. The big truth behind all things. And justice looks to the relationships. Courage looks outward towards external threats. Temperance is the one virtue that really looks inward at the person himself, and disposes the parts of the self to work as a harmonious whole.
Yep.
And the fruit of that, again, is this serenity of spirit. I think that comes from Aquinas, talking about this serenity of spirit. The primary and essential meaning of temperare, temperance, therefore, is this: to dispose various parts into one unified and ordered whole.
He says it's on 147. The purpose and goal of temperancia is man's inner order, from which alone this serenity of spirit can flow forth.
Yeah.
I like the way that you talk too about. We all probably met people in life who don't just have like joyfulness, like they're just happy all the time, or don't just kind of have sort of like an apparent peacefulness, but there's some people who just seem to have kind of serenity of not having to struggle as much anymore against like these different things, of just have by the grace of God and their work, have sort of ordered themselves habitually in such a way that temperance is a virtue of theirs. And they have a serenity about that. Their being is working in proper order. They are working as a well-ordered machine, and because of that, they are flourishing. And there's just a peacefulness about that, even in the midst of kind of their zeal and other things that may be going. There's a serenity there that's awesome.
Yeah.
And we're all like, I want that.
I wanna be like
Can
that.
I have that? Where'd you get that?
Another thing he points out, he writes on 148, it is a commonplace, though nevertheless mysterious truth, that man's inner order, unlike that of the crystal, the flower, or the animal, is not simply a given and self-evident reality, but rather that the same forces from which human existence derives its being can upset that inner order to the point of destroying the spiritual and moral person. Mm-hmm. That this cleavage in human nature, provided we do not try to persuade ourselves that it does not exist, finds its explanation only in the acceptance by faith of the revealed truth of original sin, is too vast a subject to be discussed here. It seems necessary, however, to consider more closely the structure of that inner order and disorder. I read further than I meant to there. But the point is, though, like in the crystal, in the flower, in the dog, that inner order is sort of just given to them. They're not affected by original sin in the way that we are. They have their nature, and it just flows from them, and they follow their programming, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But we find ourselves with all those drives and orders inside us. Like, we're the one being who, in this really unique human way, can really be self-destructive, and like in a very purposeful, willed way that we can allow ourselves to self-destruct. One passion, one drive taking over all the rest and messing everything up. And so unlike the animal or the flower or the crystal, we have to unless there's something physically wrong with the animal, but we have to realize that order in us. And again, it's something we can't do alone. We do it in cooperation with God's grace, right. but he's helping to reorder and mend the effects of sin. Right. In us. So So it talks about how the powers within ourselves that flow from our being and are ordered towards basically the flourishing of our being are also now, because of our fallenness, the same powers which can use wrongly destroy. So it kind of work towards the destroying of our being. So what are those powers that are kind of, because of our fallenness, are sometimes at war, not with each other, but basically with themselves within us? Yeah, Aquinas would call them the concupiscible appetites, or these appetites of desire. But it's for things like food and drink and sex. Mm-hmm. These things that naturally are supposed to be about the preservation of the species, of bringing about new life, bringing about the flourishing of life. But it goes beyond food and drink and sex. It's also things like our desire for kind of affirmation and self-fulfillment. He talks about this a little bit later. Right. Well, he says he gives kind of three essential, sort of like very primal, primitive ones that we can all see where others flow from those things. But he says self-preservation, self-assertion, and self-fulfillment are essentially the force, or the kind of the three primary things. And the forces of those things are there are real forces kind of inside of us that are good, but easily become disordered because they are taken out of they're taken out of proper order in relation to all the other things that are part of our being that God has made us to be. Right. I liked what he said. Man, what he said, I loved this, because the more I thought about it, I was just kind of fascinated by it. I think he said, since the first sin, man has been not only capable of loving himself more than he loves God as creator, but contrary to his own nature, inclined to do so. It's interesting to think of primitive man, as Adam and Eve, of actually just completely naturally loving God more than themselves. Right. That's an awesome thing. Sometimes we think of Adam and Eve as like
God made them in the garden, and it's like they're like, thanks God, and now it's like they wander around just doing kind of whatever they want and just kind of about themselves, But it's like no, they loved God more than themselves, or that that would have been what was natural, and that was an ordering of things within themselves. That even self-assertion and self-fulfillment and self-preservation and all those things that come along with it, that flow from them, like eating and drinking and sex and all that stuff, it all took its place. It all was kind of ordered within themselves, in the proper
trajectory.
Trajectory.
I mean, it was all oriented toward the love of God.
Yeah. Well, yeah, oriented toward, and none of them would. None of them were sought to break out of their natural kind of habitat.
Yeah. The harmony among them.
Of taking expressing themselves outward and grabbing and taking more than was appropriate in such a way that would destroy a higher good. I like that way he talks about that. These things, when they're perverted, they reach out in such a way and try to overindulge in such a way so that they destroy a higher good. And that just wouldn't have happened. Our order was that way.
Yeah.
And now, it's not that inner ordering is completely destroyed.
Yeah.
But our tendency is for the lower things to break out and to destroy higher things.
Yeah, I mean, Genesis is so fascinating because we have in the first couple this original perfect trust in God that allows for like a perfect selflessness, like they're perfectly turned outward in perfect love of God and each other, because they have this perfect trust in God too. But the original temptation, right, is to distrust God and be self-concerned. And it's funny, it's like as soon as like there's a one step down that path, it becomes really hard to climb back out of that. Because again, we're getting into a bit of a paradox here that we're going to explore more in the next episode. But that's how, like, on the one hand, all these drives within us, these passions, these appetites, are for self-preservation, and they're good because they're created by God. But in the context of selfishness, they break out and become disharmonious and destructive. Whereas in the context of selflessness, that original selflessness, this perfect outward other-centeredness, love of God and of each other, those things stayed in perfect harmony. And so the self-preservation that is involved in our human being, whether it's a selfless self-preservation or it's a selfless self-preservation, as Pieper calls it, that's really the key. And that's what we're going to talk about a lot next time is Pieper talks about temperance as this selfless self-preservation that we practice, and it's sort of the result of this practice of reordering things.
And that loops all the way back around to what we were talking about before that. That is what is so difficult to talk about. When it comes to temperance compared to the other virtues,
right?
It's because we have to be able to discern and order things in such a way such that we can engage the powers and actually embrace powers of self-preservation, and yet doing them in a selfless way.
Right.
It's like, that's a tough thing to actually keep ordered properly,
right.
In one's soul, and really discern how to do that. But it's so important because the only other answer is to basically, as we talked about, is just kind of throw everything away. And that's not helpful. It's not good for us, but it's also not good for our love of God, because it treats what he treats ourselves with denigration. And that's not what he calls us to do. He doesn't call us to destroy ourselves. He calls us just to love others and God more than we love ourselves, and we do that actually properly with this. But with temperance,
I think this points a little bit to the reason why temperance is sort of I think there's a reason for the ordering. It's the fourth, because it's in the context of prudence, justice, and courage that then we're able to now approach temperance, and again, preview of the next episode, understand what a selfless self-preservation would look like. How a self-preservation would be an act of justice in relation to God, to treat oneself as someone that in obedience to God, in justice to God, I care for like I would care for my neighbor. So we're going to get to that. We're going to dig more into that. So thank you for joining us for this episode of Deep in Christ. This was our introduction to temperance. It's a little bit messy, perhaps, but we're going to get more focused as we go. This is such an important virtue. It's a much more complex one than I think the others, but we're gonna dig in. And so next episode, we're going to talk about self-preservation as this image of temperance that I think really gets us into theoretically and practically how important it is and what it looks like as something we grow in. But then beyond that, we'll get into the specific areas. We'll talk about temperance in relation to food and drink and sex and knowledge, studiositas and curiositas, different relationship to knowledge and learning. Humility and pride will come up. Anger, which is this passion that we, again, another good passion God put in us, but has to be ordered rightly. And a couple other areas I probably forgot as well. So we're going to get into those. I hope you'll join us for those conversations. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed this week's discussion on the virtue of temperance, the first in this new series on this fourth of the four cardinal virtues. I really like Aquinas' definition of temperance, this serenity of spirit arising from an inner order. I think that really is helpful because we come at this virtue, like the other virtues, with so many preconceptions. And I really do think we often get stuck on just the merely negative aspect of this virtue. And it does, I think our conceptions of this virtue tend to put all of our emphasis, all of our effort, all of our focus back on our own efforts rather than God's grace. If we're just thinking of temperance as this restraining of passion, this not doing the thing, then we tend to focus just on our own efforts. But I think looking at temperance as the serenity of spirit arising from inner order turns the focus back to God's grace, both his original grace in how he created our human nature as good, but also his grace that he gives us now to reorder, to help begin to turn ourselves back outwards and to understand how to organize ourselves in such a way that we realize, the beauty of human nature as God intended it to be. So again, I hope you find that definition helpful. We're going to dig into it more. Next week, we're going to go a little bit deeper and explore Joseph Pieper's definition, kind of a further elaborating definition of temperance as selfless self-preservation. That is, selfless as opposed to selfish self-preservation as this definition of temperance. And that in a sense, in justice, as an act of justice, in obedience to God, we are in charge of ourselves. And so we take care of ourselves as someone that God has put us in charge of. But it's not a selfish, it's not an ego-driven and egocentric self-preservation or self-focus or self-love. It is in fact a God-focused, an outward-focused, an act of justice that is the care and the order and the discipline that we give to ourselves. And so I think this further definition gets us into a much more practical territory as we dig into all the other aspects of temperance, all the ways that temperance flowers or fails in different aspects of our life: food and drink and sexuality and human flourishing and anger and all the other aspects of our human being. It's going to be a really great discussion. I'm glad you're following along with us. So with all that in mind, as always, if you enjoy what we're doing here on this show, be sure to subscribe and like and follow and your favorite podcast app and all that kind of stuff. And certainly, if you are someone who is investigating the Catholic Church, if you yourself are a convert, if you're in RCAA, if you're thinking about becoming Catholic, or if you're just, a Christian brother and sister who simply has questions, who simply open, hey, the Coming Home Network is here for you. We're a network of converts to Catholicism and other people, other Christians of goodwill who are just investigating or asking questions or maybe on the journey. And so we're a community of people supporting one another in the faith. And so we've got a lot of great resources on our website, www.chnetwork.org, videos and stories and apologetics articles if you have questions over there. But regardless of where you are in that journey, whether you're on the journey or not, The point of this show is that as we figure out where we're supposed to be in our Lord's church, as we discern those questions, in the meantime, we have to continue walking with Christ every day. So that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about the life of virtue, the life of following Christ, the life of prayer. So again, stick around, and the best place to follow this show and to participate, to interact with us and other members of the network is at community.chnetwork.org. That's our online community for the Coming Home Network International. We'd love to have you a part of this discussion there. So once again, this has been Deep in Christ. We'll hope to see you again next week. God bless.